Good afternoon, everybody. I'm sorry, I think I'm going on in English, but stop me anyhow if you want. I can understand a bit of Spanish or Catalan, but I'm not able to speak it, so sorry for that. As Matteo mentioned, we carry on our research as part of this program together with the students. Because, of course, ISEA is a sort of a Fachhochschule, what would be called in Germany, which means it's derived from an applied art program, and it doesn't have a section devoted to research, but this as a pro, I would say, because our research is a practice-based one, because, of course, we need to engage students and teaching in a research practice in order to be able to set it up. And I think it has a lot of potential because, in fact, we started looking at artifacts and things, working as if it was a laboratory, and then we take the results and we have a look at it and we share them. And so I'm really glad I have the opportunity today here to be able to share some, like, I would say, preliminary results out of this research, and I would be eager for feedbacks, I would say. Writings, whatever it means. My research is gonna be dealing with writing. I'm a graphic design and typographer. And what I started to work on with my students in the last year has mainly to do with how typography and writing would react to contemporary issues and to the COVID crisis especially. But not just being limited to this situation specifically, but also overlooking it to see the potential we have in the long terms. Because as Jorge and others were saying before, actually this pandemic was able to show us a lot of idiosyncrasies and issues that are at play in contemporary societies. It's sort of a lens which makes easier to see things, contradictions. Which are already present. The big question we started our research with is how do typologies of writing in terms of systems like forms, composition, relate with contents and context? Like how is it possible to think writing and typography in relation to the content is meant to communicate and to the context in which these systems are used? It's a big question, I know. It's a historical one as well. But we were quite positive in that and brave, I would say. And we wanted to study the relationship between different aspects of writings, between syntactic, semantic, and pragmatic terms, understanding typography and writing at large from a relational perspective. This word has a very specific meaning in what I'm saying, and it refers to the work by Roy Harris, a semiotician who first dealt with the term of relational typography and relational writing, which means to consider writings for what it allows to and for the use individual and social groups makes of it. So we are only able to understand writing if we don't look just at forms, I would say, but we take into account the relationship that writing systems enable. Well, this took us to consider typography and writing as a matter which react and depend on contemporary issues and specific circumstances we work in. A tool, I would say, which would allow both to understand the conditions we live in and also which becomes useful to produce reality. So it emerges out of the current condition, but is also able to shape current conditions. So there is an agency in writing. How to do so? Well, we took into account a number of aspects in our practical investigation, which are technological constraint, formal and expressive issues, because the intention we had was to overcome the opposition, like usual opposition between form and content, which is still a trap for graphic designer, I would say. The aim was mainly to expand our focus to systemic issues and procedural aspects of writing and typography. So focusing on the process and not just in the forms of writing and the forms of typography. So not just the end result, but how do we get there? How to get to this end result? In order to rethink typography and writing, we need to make a shift and start to think about writing ecosystems, I would say, which are a compounded reality made of techniques and technologies, understood from a social perspective and embedded to economy issue. So in this sense, typography and writing becomes in fact a political act, I would say. Tools and processes are the starting point for a critical reflection on writing. So we started to look in a very pragmatic way to the tools we were using and to possibility of producing new tools in order to define new ways of writing and define new science as well in forms, instead of starting to forms, like from forms and getting the other way around. The history of writing and typography cannot be detached, as Robin Kiro said many times, from that of its producers, of the users and the messages themselves. Elizabeth Eisenstein underlined this a few decades ago already, like how social issues and political issues are strongly intertwined with technical facts. I just want to make a reference to a couple of texts, a couple of books which are very different in form. This is a text by the American critic and graphic designer Andrew Blauvelt, which goes under the title Tools or Post-Production for Graphic Designers. And this part of this catalog, Graphic Design and Production, which went together with an exhibition under the same name in 2011. Blauvelt in this text point out the relevance of tools in graphic design and in writing, especially. And what I want to point out is the fact that tools are not just things we use to make things, but tools makes ourselves somehow. Like as we use them, we also change our way of thinking and the way we relate with others and with objects as well. Of course, he recalls the amazing movie by Kubrick, the Planet of Apes, in order to underline this relevance of tool in the history of humankind. And he point out four main key issues in this discourse, which I think are relevant for our consideration to this extent, I would say. Like, first of all, the intelligence of objects, as I was saying just before. The fact that objects are not just inanimated things we make use of, but in fact are able to develop different skills in the people who make use of them. The fact that tools become role changers, which means, if we relate it to graphic design, for instance, that using new tools is not just a way to make things differently, but also take us to rethink our role as producers of sign in this circumstance, as designers, I would say. So what we used to do before is not in our power anymore. We delegate it quite often to someone else or to an object or to a machinery, and we take on other duties instead. Also, the very important thing of having a bionivocal relationship between tools and object, as I was said, like we shape tools and we are shaped by tools. And the fact that our way of working is adaptive respective to tools. They are sort of prosthetic, I would say, which we use, but at the same time are part of our own body. Andrew Blauvelt make a straight reference to this huge, I would say, project, the Last Waller Catalog, which is this book, or rather this series of books published by Stuart Brand in 1968, and was a collection of tools and resources that were also on sale through this catalog, I would say, that were a disposal of people to build their own environment. So like the basic idea under this Wall Earth Catalog project was to give people the tools they would need to make their own environment and to build their own world, basically. Stuart Brand, in releasing this project, point out a few aspects which I think are really interesting because they show a lot of connections with our contemporary practice as designer. He said that this book was useful as a tool. So this book, this knowledge was a tool per se, the fact that it would have become relevant to independent education. So this stress of the connection between tools and education and self-education. And also the fact that it was making possible to use high quality objects or low cost object, which is quite weird to put together high quality and low cost, but this is actually something which we are getting familiar with nowadays in terms of digital tools and technologies. And the fact that it was easily available via mail, and you see the typos here, email, but it's a good typo because it made me say what I want to say, in fact, that it was somehow forthcoming what would have come after. This was available as knowledge and tools available via mail and now are available via email, I would say. So technological shifts and changes, to sum it up, do have an impact on our work as graphic designer. And this is something which we could see many times in the history of design. We could see it in the switch from hot metal type to photo composition in the 50s, and again in the onset of desktop publishing from the 80s. And we see it even nowadays when new technologies are emerging. So what about today? Things, I would say, have changed again a lot. We can see everywhere somehow a new passion and interest in the making with our own hands in person, so taking charge of aspects related with production and development without delegating them to someone else anymore. We could say that we got back in time somehow, but this would be misleading. In fact, it's not really as it used to be, I would say. We moved from what can be considered a form of pre-production, what we were used to a condition of post-production nowadays. Like before desktop publishing, the designer was actually making things with his or her own hands by prototyping and defining a set of rules and instruction you would have then passed on to people in charge of production. While nowadays it's the opposite situation. Basically, we start making by using things which are already out in the market, in the media, through all channels, things that we get and we manipulate and we arrange and we resinify, we could say. So we are post-producer and not pre-producer anymore as designers. So we become more and more producer of structures, of systems, instead of producers of objects. Our role is becoming more and more that of programmers of action and facilitators, I would say, as we provide conditions which allow design to be, but we don't actually design any longer. I mean, it happens very often that we don't design anymore, but we just set up the condition in order for design to happen. So we said many things. I think I want to point them out in a few key issues, which is this shift from form to formats, which is defining contemporary graphic design practice, is the relevance of context, which is becoming more and more pressing, and the collapsing of production and consumption, which is something that can be well summarized by Bruno Latour's work when he says that as we consume images, we produce images. As graphic designer, we produce a lot of images, but we consume them at the same time and the other way around. It's almost impossible to make any distinction between these two things. All these set of conditions are things that were already there, of course, before the pandemic, before the crisis, but the crisis made quite easier to see them and to perceive them, not just in the professional field, but also for the general public. And this is a big difference, I would say. It became very urgent to tackle these issues and to sort of ask ourselves as designer what would be our role in this condition, I would say. What are these conditions? In terms of context, is a context characterized by a hyperconnectivity and the re-evaluation of the local scale on the opposite side. Like it is a situation full of contradiction, I would say. From the technological point of view, we saw more and more the emergence and the use of shared software environment. But at the same time, between like a side of this pervasive use of technology, we saw the emerging of lo-fi hardware tools, because we had in fact to deal also with in-house production tools in the literal sense of the word, because we couldn't get out of our home. Also contents change and were characterized, I would say, from what we could call a sort of redundancy in terms of messages and in high speed of circulation, which is a very interesting thing. Like as we were unable to move, at the same time we could see how messages were speeding up very quick, and having a sort of a pinpoint effect from one channel to the other. So I want to make a big jump back in time with this sentence now from Herbert Bayer, pioneer of modern typography, who in his essay on typography in 1967 wrote something like that. The typography revolution was not an isolated event, but went hand in hand with a new social, political consciousness, and consequently with the building of new cultural foundations. The artist's acceptance of the machine as a tool for mass production has had its impression on aesthetic concepts. It sounds very interesting and powerful as a sentence to make us ask ourselves, what about today? What if we would relate this urgency in typography and in writing to the contemporary condition? How would we react to the contemporary condition? So this was a bit of a starting point of what we've been working on, to see how we could pick up this sentence, this motivation from the past, and translate it into contemporary, in the contemporary conditions. So we wanted at first to expand the field of investigation from typography to writing systems in general, because of the fluidity of writing systems nowadays, which doesn't allow anymore to separate in a very precise way between typographic composition, writing, or other forms of production of the alphabet. So we tried to bring it down to very basic questions, I would say, to start working. How to compose an alphabet nowadays? Do we draw it? Do we compose it? Do we generate it via software? How to set letters together? How to set words together? And the answers were many. Answers we tried and we tested in practice, because we realized that the answer could be a collection of tools as well as a set of instructions to be followed in a more or less consistent way. It can be a software, a physical object. So we cannot talk about forms only. We need to talk about processes, forms, tool, environments, what I said before to be ecosystems of writing, I would say. Also, I want to make a short reference to what Alessandro Ludovico defines post-digital print scenario, which was really something useful for us to start working, to think, to be actually acting within this scenario, which is a contingency in which analog and digital processes cannot be detached, are strongly intertwined and impossible to discern. So as this is actually a state of fact, how can we take advantage of it? So we started to look at history as a repository of practices, of examples we could mix up, we could use according to different intended use of writing. But being aware that each writing system, each example from history is bringing with it social issues, political issues, so it cannot just be used at random, I would say, but is a way of producing facts and of transforming our own environments. This idea of playing or investigating form of production in writing is not something new or recent, I would say. We have a few examples which are quite interesting from really like 2008 and before. I want to show just a couple of them, few of them, more than a couple, sorry, but to give an overview of the breadth of the possibilities when we talk about writing system. I was talking about forms, I was talking about processes. It's very difficult to separate the things, and I think also it's good not to separate these things, because in fact they interact one to the other. These Empty Words is a project by Jörg Leni from 2008, something which looked very simple nowadays because we got more and more used to this sort of project, but was sort of groundbreaking when he decided to implement a process where people could send out messages which were then translated by a computer and then printed out with this hole printer, which is a very old printer. He was able to make work with this system. And then the printout were becoming sort of after to set up a physical space. It's a very simple process nowadays because we use it, but it was interesting in the way that it put at work very different technologies together and thought writing in terms of a material form, like something which is able actually to constitute a space. This is something completely different now. Is a typeface, or well, we could better say a system, writing system by Philippe Apellois, the French typographer. In 2005, he designed this system which makes letter out of these small diagonal lines, which react to the width and the proportion, like the ratio of the screen, which again, this interactivity is something quite easy to understand now, but it's interesting to see how letters are here by chance, in fact. They are letters, but as we stretch the window of something change and the letters disappear, becomes an image. So it's more like an environment for producing sign than a writing system per se, if there is any difference. This is again a different thing by the Abache collective, UK collective. Calice Deep Blue is a font they designed in 2014 for the SALT, Istanbul Art Center. Here what they did was to use the typeface as a collection of hyperlink. Instead of designing new forms, they just decided which content to curate and to link to the alphabet. As it is a type which is just intended to be used in the digital environment, it became a sort of an interface for delivering content. So it becomes like the typeface becomes an exhibition space somehow, a curatorial space. This is a project by a student of RISD in Providence, web typography for the lonely, where basically started to draw typographic shape by writing CSS code, HTML code. So there is no actual drawing of letter forms by the set of instruction on a browser, which in turns produce letter shapes or forms or signs. It's just an environment again, but it's an open environment, and this is something which is quite interesting to me, and we're gonna consider later as well, the possibility to produce signs starting from a different way of writing, like our two different writing systems, the binary code of the digital and the writing of the alphabet, but we can make them work together somehow. And this sort of provocation by Jonathan Bouquet, Text Pencil, here with a plugin for InDesign in 2007, he tried to combine two different gestures, like the writing on the keyboard we're getting used to, and the use of the mouse as a gestural tools somehow, so that we could write a text and then spread the letters in the screen by using our mouse. Again, something very simple, but which shows the different possibility in terms of linearity and non-linearity of writing in the digital realm. And this is Yearline or Mine by Moniker, interaction design studio based in Amsterdam from 2004. I wanted to briefly show it because it underlines the relational aspect of writing, understood as the production of science. Basically, each guest here is invited to connect a few dots, very simple action. One after the other, together they produce a work, a collective work, which becomes in turn an animation and an environment. So making people realize the potential of community and the potential of a simple sign, like a simple stroke line in building up a community. This is a very last example I wanted to include because it's sort of an ironic take on it. It's a project by Tibor Kalman from 1987. he used the simple board we could find in restaurants and cafes as a writing tool somehow, a writing ecosystem, I would say, just not using it in the conventional way. Some aspects which are not the informative one, but are more the ones linked to identity and expressivity emerge. So it's just a different ways of using a very simple writing tool, writing system. So our own investigation focused on lo-fi technologies and mainly in-house resources. As we were in lockdown, in a quite difficult condition, we wanted to focus on what we could do with what we had around us. In some cases, the writing system became an introduction to professional tools or instruments, sort of with an educational purpose, I would say. And quite often it becomes both the subject and the object of the investigation, sort of a self-reflective space of investigation. We use GDoc, Excel environment, which could become both tools and environments for writing. Digital home printers, which could become powerful tool for producing in-house graphics. And it could even get back to paper and scissors, quite old things. Or again, to make use of our mobile phone as a torch, as a beamer for projecting graphic science and alphabets. I'm just gonna get through a few examples we realized together with students. These are all projects from this workshop. This is by Eugenio Pancaldi. Communication is not solo play. Basically, he provided a set of forms which could be filled in, and then by using a software which is available online, translated into a MIDI file to be played. Here we see like the filled form, and then here the MIDI track, which could then be transformed into sound. This Poesia Modale is a tool developed by Felipe Menicucci, in which the user can decide the speed of the line running, the running line of text, and the dimension of the text, and then it starts writing. But he has to fight against the constraint of the time. It's like if you had a metronome and you have to fight with it for writing. And this very simple thing provoke a shift in our perception of writing, because at some point we start to think of it in terms of rhythm and from a musical stance, and we lose the idea instead of having to deal with text, with words, which has a meaning. So we start to play music somehow instead of writing. And also, then you could collect all your examples and share them on a website. Because what we wanted to do is to provide all this research, in progress research, of course, as a set of resources online. So the end result was a folder with a set of subfolder on a drive, hard drive, which were open for everybody to use. Carlo worked instead on the idea of censorship in social media, Instagram especially, and designed this small tool for setting text which cannot be detected by Instagram. So you can basically write whatever you want and then decide pattern size, text size, colors, and many other parameters, let's say, and then you can download your PNG image and upload it on Instagram, which won't know what you write. He also designed a small website, a small font to go with it, which worked at its best in the system. And we have also an analog counterpart of this, which is a project by Benedetta. She recalled the technology of phototype setting and tried to make a very like lo-fi version of it by using the mobile torch as a beamer, as I was saying before. In this case, the project is just a set of very basic letter shape you could cut out as to build your own beamer and then reproduce distorted text in the lived environment, so in an analog space. We saw before this project by Abaca in which the typeface would become sort of an interface for delivering other content. Sort of a metaphor, I would say. This is also the direction taken by Buttaroni, Bartoccini, and Ducchi with Curiosity Killed the Letter. Basically, they set up a small software in which you can compose your letter shapes, and then you can make a collection of it online, and also link contents to it. So it becomes a sort of a platform for sharing knowledge, not just about typography, but about anything you want to say. At the same time, you can collect shapes by others, and becomes also a tools for having some lettering you could use, designed by someone else, and you may want in your design. This prototype project instead is quite interesting to me because it's really basic in the technology used, sort of anchoring somehow Word or GDoc or Pages as application, and transform them into tools for producing graphics by picking up shapes and composing them into this layer grid. In something which can be used by, of course, like different publics. It's very open. This is quite interesting also to me. Many of these tools do not have an intended public, but are more open researches, and then anybody could use it. And what we did basically was to use them in the class also. And I found, like, after 2 months, someone making a poster using a tool designed by someone else in the first semester, for instance, and which had a completely different intention at the very beginning. Supertesto is more of a provocation, I would say. Is a tool by Erika Rossi. Is this just stack of paper? You could fill in this grid to draw your letter shapes, and is a sort of a reminder to the Super Monumento project by Superstudio. This provocation that, in fact, writing, very simple and normative way of writing, could on one side enable people to express themselves, but on the other hand, it also prevent people to express themselves. So it has this sort of contradiction. And she also tried to use it in very different environment. Like, it could become a branding tool, or it could become a sort of a normative tool, or a tool which allow people to express themselves. It embodies a lot of contradiction, and it's perfectly fitting the fact that you could buy it on Amazon for a cheap price. This, I guess, we're getting towards the end. It's a different way of understanding writing. And this project by Andalò, Micheli, and Pala is a clock. So it's about the writing of time. It's an analog clock. You can print out, cut it out, and make it by yourself with cheap material. But you have to choose what you want to remind yourself during the day. You can just pick one thing. So it's sort of a alarm, but just for one thing, like what would be most important for you for that day. And we finish with a very ironic take on it. This guy who designed a sort of hacking for the rubric cube. So basically you print it out on rubber, and you can transform your cube into a printing tool. Well, all these results allow us to observe a set of projects which are characterized by a set of conditions which I wanted to point out. Sometimes these conditions become the objectives of the project themselves. We see lo-fi techniques, or sometimes techniques which mediate between lo-fi and hi-fi. We saw participatory project, or sometimes just shared project in the way they were produced. Open were the sources, other times open was the use, which was not intended from the very beginning. Many of these projects have a critical attitude, or they question themselves, or why we should basically write in a certain condition nowadays, and many of them have an informative potential, which becomes educational quite often. Like, we saw many projects in which basically what students wanted to do was to explain people what they are doing, basically, so to provide people more knowledge and skills about typography and about design and about writing. So they had an educational purpose. And all of them were self-reflective, basically. Were not just about typography, were not just typography, but were about typography. So a reflection on what they do. Designing new writing ecosystems always engage with existing models and is a way to comment on them. As writing means performing social and political relationship, a new condition asks for new ways of writing. And I think this is true both for the professional field and in our daily life as sign makers. At the same time, new processes, tools, resources, expertise would have an impact on our own environment. So all these to say that these projects are sort of an open call to all those interested in developing a transdisciplinary approach to writing and experiment with writing, because I mean, we had just one point, one perspective, which is that of the designer, but as you saw, there are many connections from different disciplinary areas we cannot go without. So let's experiment on writing, whatever it means. Thank you. Grazie.
Actually, it's very fascinating because the other day I was talking to people who work in the films and video, and they were speaking about the use that they did about the found footage.
Yes.
All these archives at home. Actually, for example, the main film produced in Spain last year, which actually achieved many gold and many awards, is a found footage film. Mexican wrestler. So it's funny to see, you somehow were talking about post-production in design. It's very fascinating, the connection between other realms, for example, film and cinema. And definitely I know a lot about this, but on footage somehow is this idea of post-production. I think you are actually underlining this too.
Yeah. I think, I mean, that's really important. I think both to understand our role as designer, but also to rethink the relationship between professional and non-professional, I think. This is something we were talking about, like while working to here, that this topic of the relationship between amateur and professional, it seems to be gone somehow, like something related in postmodernism trends from the 80s, but in fact it's becoming more and more relevant. So it's something we really should take care of, I would say.
Somehow the COVID, the lockdown, I mean, this is when we're talking about this long-term disaster. This is not a disaster, this is a long-term process. But the COVID somehow was like a paramount. It's being the way of revealing all these processes that were somehow behind. Right?
Yeah, actually, this is something else I wanted to say before that. In fact, all the presentation and the process is not really relating strictly to the COVID crisis, but is really looking at long-term effects and opportunities somehow. So, yeah, I think this was sort of a critical time in which we could be more aware of what's going on, and also is a sort of a point where we can decide if we want actually to tackle these issues or not. So yeah, we shouldn't miss the opportunity, I guess, and we are all here for that.
I also have some remarks and also a question. First of all, thank you because your contribution was really interesting. I mean, most of all, your remarks upon the kind of we would say performative nature of tools, right? When you just try to shed light on the fact that somehow like tools end up redesigning us, and this is a very interesting idea that there's also kind of getting food and design in the design theory nowadays. This idea of the ontological design, what is designs us back, right? And so I think probably as we had the chance to also to say in Rubino in a few conversations that we had, I think there's a notion that it's really, that might be crucial for you in this type of inquiries that you make is the notion of performativity. Is the notion that something that is, as you say, like something is like a typography is shaped, but it shapes back, right? So this idea of being shaped and shaping at the same time. And of course, like there are like also remarks that reminded me of what Walter Benjamin said about the nature of the medium itself, the author as producer. So we should like reconsider our task as producer of content when the tools change. So the paradigm is changing, and so we have like this change of paradigm opens up new possibilities of conceiving our work. And then third remark, like is concerned with what we were talking about, like just a few hours before about the partage du sensible, the distribution of the sensible, because what Rancière says, and you know it very well, that is actually this, right? This kind of political divide between what is supposedly content and what is form and what is content, and what is lo-fi and what is hi-fi, what is an amateur and what is a professional. So these are all like kind of lines in which this idea of distribution of the sensible might be very useful. And also this idea that you also reminds me of this idea that you can actually use, for example, or employ software like Pages or Word for actually creating images, which is something it was conceived for. So it's like kind of hacking and working around the pluripotentialities that the tools have in the sense, and has a lot to do with this idea of distribution of the sensible. One question that I wanted to ask you, of course, you are talking about, of course you are talking about the digital realm, but you talked about this idea of performativity of tools. What about materials? Because I think here there's another kind of realm in which I think it's interesting to delve into.
I think it's really a quite interesting question, because in fact, like from the very beginning, I really wanted to stress out also in the work we carried out with students, the importance of not separating like the analog from the digital, and some project actually came out of that, taking advantage of this impossibility of separating the two fields, which I think now is something we are used to, but we are not aware of sometimes. So it's something which could be explored even more, especially as I was referring before to Roy Harris for this idea of relational writing and typography. And Roy Harris is pushing a lot the attention on the fact that we cannot just look at typography or writing in books if we want to liberate the potential of writing, because there is much more potential in writing with ends, or informal writing or daily writing we do without technological tools, in fact, which has been overlooked throughout history. And yes, I think there is plenty of space for actually investigating the potentiality of all that part of writing, which has nothing to do with digital technology. I think was also had a lot to do with the condition in which we were working. I mean, we were just in front of our screen, basically.
Thank you.
Grazie.